Hey guys, welcome to our sketching tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about how you can more effectively turn your reference photos into sketches. So I'm going to outline some concepts first that we're going to go over, and then I'm going to get into a little bit of demonstration with the actual reference images to show you guys some of these concepts in action. And I've broken them down into some simpler components for you guys so that it's a little bit easier to digest and understand. The first concept here that we're going to talk about is shapes and directions. Now here on the screen, we have a reference image for a portrait, and when you're trying to approach this image to be able to capture it in your drawing, usually the first thing that I like to do in my process is I like to find the major shapes that compose this portrait. So this is the idea of shapes and direction. So you can see that there's one big shape that outlines the head, and then there's another big shape that kind of encompasses the rest of the body. This is very important for me because in my workflow, I prefer to work from the outside in. I prefer to work from big down to small. Something that I never do in my workflow is start with one eye and then build out around it. This method does not work for me. It might work for some other people, but for me personally, I prefer to work from big down to small so that I have a plan of where I'm trying to go. So now that we've spoken about shape, where does direction come in? Well, direction is actually really important because if you're trying to construct this shape in your drawing, you have to keep in mind the directions that each face of that shape is traveling in. So for example, the front of our character's face here is traveling in this direction while the top of his head is traveling in this direction. And when you actually try to capture this reference image in your own drawing, you want to make sure that the direction that the front of the face and the top of the head are traveling in mirror the directions in your reference image. Now, if I were to change the direction on these surfaces, and you can see here, I only tweaked the angle of this line by a very small amount, but this shape no longer looks like the shape that you find in the reference image. So it's very important to pay very close attention to the exact direction that each surface or face is traveling in, because the slightest miscalculation sometimes can produce a drawing that is inaccurate or less effective. So that's concept number one, shapes and directions. Concept number two is relationships and measurements. This is going to help you understand where to put down certain brush strokes, where to put down certain elements in a composition. And the thing is, if you know this really well, you're going to be able to capture portraits, environments, anything you could think of with a very high degree of accuracy. So we have a pose here that we could study. Immediately, the first thing that I look for is this kind of bounding box. Thinking back to what we said about shapes and directions, this is kind of the box that I want to place the character in. This is the overall big shape of that character that I want to start out with. Now, once I have the shape, where do I put all the different elements? Where do I put the head? Where do I put the arm? And now this is where relationships and measurements come in. For example, if I want to find the length of the head, I can draw a line at the top of the head, draw a line straight down to the chin, and this will give me the length of the head. If I were to draw a second line at the tip of her finger and then connect this back, this is going to give me a secondary length. So now if I take these lengths, and just by observing them, I can tell that the length of the head is about 1/3 of the length of this entire section here. So when I'm trying to draw these shapes out for this character, I know that the face and the head is going to be about 1/3 of the entire length of this side. It seems very mathematical, but this is something that you should get into the habit of doing as you try to observe things in a reference photo. Same thing could be done for areas such as the shoe and the hand. You want to find relationships and you want to find measurements. So for example, if you're not sure where the shoe is going to start, we can relate it to where this shirt is actually going to end. You're going to see that the shirt meets the back of the shoe. So now when we draw this character out and we plan out where the shirt is going to be, we know that the shoe is going to start where the shirt ends. And then to find the point of the shoe and where it ends, we could find a relationship between that and the tip of the finger, and that'll give you a directional line that shows you the angle between the two elements in this painting. Here's the thing, okay, there is no specific rule to tell you which things to measure and compare in each reference photo. You kind of have to do this on your own accord. And anytime you're not sure where to put a certain element in a drawing, you want to measure it, you want to compare it, you want to find relationships that can tell you where this thing might be in comparison to all the other elements in that drawing. And just as another example here, on this character, you can see the side of her face. I can see that if I draw a line straight down vertically, it's going to line right up with the outside of her elbow. So in my drawing, if these two components are lining up vertically, then I know that I've got that proportional area right. So that's a quick look at the concept of finding relationships and measurements. This is going to come up a lot when we get into our actual demo. Now, last but not least, we have the concept of negative space. You guys have probably heard this before. This basically refers to the space around your subject. So for example, you can see me in the camera right now, and the space around me will be my negative space. If I move my arm around, my negative space changes. If I put my arm up here, this area between my arm, my head, and the rest of the frame is going to be the negative space. Whereas if I put my arm down here, this entire frame is my negative space. So where negative space really comes into play is it shows you things that you might not have seen otherwise. For example, if I were drawing this character, normally we would just be looking for the shape of the head, the shape of the neck, the shape of the body, right? But if your drawing is inaccurate, a really good way to spot this is by actually looking at the shape around our subject. So this shape right here. Now, if the negative space in my drawing doesn't match up with the negative space in this drawing, then I might have done something a little bit differently than what you see in the reference photo. The thing with using negative space is it doesn't have to be a perfect one-to-one, you know, as long as I get the idea of this big shape across, you know, in my drawing, I think it'll be relatively effective. It does not have to be a one-to-one, just like how our drawing doesn't have to be a one-to-one. This is just a way to check to make sure that you've got all the right elements in all the right places. So now that you guys know these concepts, I want to jump into some quick demos so I can show you guys all of these things in action, okay? Now, I've broken down the sketching into a couple different stages. Number 1 is shape blocking, number 2 is detailing, and number 3 is refining. I've done this to make it a little bit more easy for you guys to understand and absorb, but when I'm actually painting, when I'm drawing, if you watch any of my process videos, you're gonna see that my sketching is basically just very straightforward. I put the lines down, but what you don't know is that I actually do all of this in the background in my head. The more you draw, the more comfortable you get with it, the more you're gonna be able to do this kind of in the background subconsciously without having to actively think too much about it. But as you're getting started, it's very good to keep all of these concepts in mind so that you can eventually get to a stage where you can just put lines down without, you know, having to think too hard about it. All right, so now let's jump into the demos. We're gonna start off with something very simple. This is gonna be a front view portrait. So remembering what I covered in the previous section, the first thing we wanna do is we wanna block in the shapes, okay? Keeping in mind the shapes and directions that you see in this reference image. Now, immediately I can see that there is this big bounding shape for the character, and we're gonna say the word shape a lot in this video, so get ready for that, okay? I can see this big bounding shape that kind of covers the outline of the character, and everything else is happening within. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna try to outline the shape of the character. And if you're not sure where to put your character on the canvas, here's a really cool trick. Again, this is going back to measurements and relationships, but you could look for the point where the character, the subject, actually makes contact with the edge of the canvas. So for example, these points right here, and you can measure the distance here and compare it to the length of the rest of the canvas. This is a really fast and easy way to immediately know where to put your subjects. It'll make your life a little bit easier if you're trying to take that reference photo one for one, and that's what we're gonna do here. So I'm gonna try to place the shape of the character relatively similar to what we find in the reference photo. So again, keeping in mind the directions of each surface that we see in this reference photo. And it's okay to make adjustments as you go because you're not going to get it perfect on the first go, okay? You're gonna see I'm gonna make a lot of mistakes while we're drawing, and that's totally fine. This is the sketching stage, so nothing needs to be perfect. And just by the way, guys, I'm using the No Mercy brush, which has no pressure opacity, no tapering or anything like that. I just like it because it's very simple, but you don't have to use this. I can show you guys some examples later of how you could change your line art in your sketches to make it look, different from this or a little bit more refined. But here I feel pretty good about this big shape. Now we gotta put in some of these smaller elements in this composition. The second most prominent shape to me that I see in this reference is the hairline down here and right there. This here kind of outlines the shape of the skin that is visible on our subject. Now here's the tricky part. Okay, where do we put this hairline and where do we put these sidelines? This is where we're gonna start looking for some relationships that are gonna tell us how to do this. The first thing I wanna do on my reference photo is I wanna mark down the center line of the face so that I kind of know the tilt of the head. This just makes things a little bit easier for me. But the next thing that I wanna do is I wanna find the bottom of this chin. So from what I can see here, this is about the length of the bottom of the chin versus the rest of the head. Now obviously you might not have your canvas right next to it, but based on that ratio, I think it'll look something like that. This is most likely where that chin is going to be. And remember, it's okay to make some mistakes. Your measurements are not going to be perfect the first go, but you just want to have an idea of where to put things. Now I'm just going to draw the center line down at the same angle as I see in the reference photo. Now we kind of know where the chin is going to be. I can find this hairline by measuring the distance from the top of the canvas to this hairline and the distance from the hairline to the chin. It's about halfway, but a little bit higher. So I think it should be somewhere around there according to the measurements that I find in the reference photo. And I'm gonna trust myself here in my judgment, so I'm gonna put that down. And I think that looks pretty good. Now we can come down here looking, again, keeping in mind the width of the hair here in comparison to the width of the face. So like that, taking note of how the hair changes directions as it travels down here, we're going to also change direction to try to match what we see in the reference photo. And now we can look for this shape right here that kind of caps off the edge of the hair along with the other side as well. You take note of the direction that this is traveling in. It's going to be something like that and something like that. So I'm going to just mirror what I see in that reference photo. And there I think is a pretty good bounding box for the hair that we can add more detail into. So now also taking note of where this clothing piece is going to start, it lines up with the direction of the bounding box of that hair, and the other piece of the jacket kind of comes down like this. And then from this point, I think I can connect the jaw lines, again, taking note of the direction that these lines are traveling in and how they meet the bottom of the chin. I can add them at a very similar angle. And as we get more comfortable with these big shapes, we can start adding in some of the smaller shapes. For example, the neck right there. And if you're not too sure where to put the neck, just trace this line onto the jaw and look at which point the neck intersects with the jaw. And you can see that it's a little bit below the halfway point. If this is the halfway point, it's probably going to intersect right there. This is the first stage of the sketching process. I call this the shape blocking process. So this is basically a foundation for adding in details and potentially adding in rendering on top. We always want to make sure that we start off with a solid base so that our details can be added onto something that we have a lot of confidence with. If you don't do this and you just start with the small details, that process works for some people, but the thing is, if you mess up a certain area of the proportions on the character, the time that you spent on that small detail is going to be wasted, and it's going to be a lot less efficient if you have to go back in and fix mistakes. So this just kind of makes sure that we don't make too many mistakes on things that are too time consuming. Now this is the first stage, so what do we do next? Well, to show you guys this more clearly, I'm going to actually start a new layer. I'm going to turn this opacity down so that I can draw on top of it, and I'm going to use a slightly finer brush. But here is what I call the detailing stage, okay? And I saved the facial features and everything for the detailing stage because I don't want to overwhelm myself right off the bat when I'm trying to capture the overall composition first. So in the detailing stage, this is where we can start adding in some of the curved lines. We can start adding in a little bit more, feeling of hair here. We can be a little bit more descriptive with our line art, just outlining the hair and the face. So switching the original off, you can see that we have a pretty refined looking sketch based on the big shapes that we see. Now we're going to jump into the facial features. This is always a handful, so I like to save it for a little bit later after I set the big shapes down. The first thing that I want to do is I want to find the relationships between the different elements on the face. So for example, the eyebrows, I'm going to draw a line across them to connect them so that I can understand the tilt and the direction that the head is traveling in. We're gonna do the same thing for the eyes, right? I wanna understand the angle that the head is on so that I can replicate that. And I'm gonna try to capture that eye line, which is slightly tilted on my character. Now we're gonna make some very fundamental measurements and find some relationships here. So for example, the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin, we wanna find that distance. And then we wanna find the eyebrows to the bottom of the nose. And on our character here, I think we're gonna get a little bit of a longer nose to eyebrow area versus the nose to chin area. So marking this down, I kind of know where the bottom of the nose is gonna be. I can draw in some of the nostrils, refining the details there a little bit. Now I wanna take some measurements of the eyes. So looking at the outer corner and the inner corner, as well as the inner corner and outer corner of the other eye, we can kind of see that the eyes and the spacing in between the eyes are basically 3 equal distances apart. This is one of the most fundamental measurements that you're gonna see on a lot of portraits. So we're gonna try to bring that into our drawing here. I'm gonna try to divide that section into 3 equal parts using the measurements and relationships. And now I can apply that curve following the shape that I see of the eye. And I like to save this for the detailing stage because this is all very small and refined and not very big picture in terms of the overall drawing. So I can erase some of the guidelines here. And now kind of marking in the direction of the lower eyelid. And there we go, there we have our pair of eyes. Now when I'm more confident with their placement, I can start adding in even smaller details like the folds on the eyelids and, you know, taking note of the inner corner of the eye and how it lines up with the inside of the eyebrows. I'm going to place the eyebrows right there. They're going to end on the inner corners of the eyes. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look for the outside, the width of the nose. And this is very simple. We're going to look for more relationships here. When you draw a line up from the outside of the nose, it's going to actually intersect with the inner corner of the eyes. So finding this relationship, this is going to tell us how wide the nose should be. I know that this all seems very mathematical, but this is actually what happens in my head as I'm trying to observe a reference photo and put it into drawing form. The more practice you get with this, the more comfortable you're going to be and the less you're going to have to think about it. So now looking down at the outer corners of the mouth, I can see that it kind of comes down at an angle when compared to the width of the nose. So I know that drawing a line down here, these should be about the outer corners of the mouth. And in order to know how high to put the mouth on the face, we can find the line that breaks the 2 lips and intersect that with the vertical line in the middle here. And we're gonna see that it is much closer to the bottom of the nose than it is to the bottom of the chin. So we're gonna know that this line is gonna be right about there. I am spending a little bit more time on this piece so that you guys can really grasp the basics. And when I turn the original off here, you can see we have a pretty compelling rendition of our reference image. Now it's not a perfect one-to-one and you shouldn't expect a perfect one-to-one. As long as you're drawing and not tracing, there are going to be some differences between your drawing and the reference photo. So now we're going to move on to stage 3, and this is the refinement stage. This is where we take a good look at our sketch, see if there are any mistakes, and really troubleshoot this so that it is fully ready to be rendered and we're fully confident in what we have in the sketch. My favorite method for this stage in the drawing is very simple. We want to go to image, we want to go to image rotation, and then we're going to flip canvas horizontal. So when you flip this canvas, you're going to be able to see things that you might not have spotted otherwise. And in my case, I think the head is shifted a little bit towards one side, and I would have never caught that if I hadn't flipped the canvas. And I think the eyes are also a little bit low, which once again, we're all going to make mistakes like these. It's totally fine to make them, and it's actually best that you catch these mistakes in this stage of your drawing. So now the simplest way to actually fix these mistakes, my favorite way, is to just use Liquify tool. I don't want to erase and then have to redraw it on again. I just want to use the lines that are currently already there. So looking at the preview, if I toggle it on and off, very small changes, but I think this will make a pretty big difference in the actual drawing. Here I'm also noticing that I forgot to add this side of the neck. Again, we want to make sure that we don't miss things before we send this drawing off to be rendered. And really in this stage, you could start adding in a little bit more detail. This is all about your personal preference and how much you want to add into the sketch, but you could really flesh this out a little bit more because now we're confident with the base that we have set for the character. And then I'm going to flip it back, and then you might spot more things that you might not have seen. But now I think the sketch looks pretty good and I would be confident to render this piece. Here's the thing, I did it with the No Mercy brush, which has no taper or anything, so it looks very rigid and very technical. But you could also use something like the Line 2.0 with pressure opacity, and you could go for something a little bit more traditional. You could really add in some variations in line quality, really make this look more like a traditional drawing. And I'm just gonna quickly turn this layer off. So, you know, there's a little bit of a different feeling, a little bit of a different style. It really just depends on your personal preference, but this is generally the process that I like to follow when I'm approaching any kind of reference photo and trying to turn it into a sketch that is ready for rendering, or, you know, ready for whatever else you might want to do with it. But yeah, switching between the two, you can see there's quite a difference between the styles here. It's completely up to your personal preference. There is no right or wrong for this. Okay, so now moving on from portraits, this is a pose. This one should be pretty fun. We're gonna try to capture that big shape that is kind of like the bounding box of this character. Now, remembering what we said before in the initial breakdown portion, I'm going to draw a line from here to here, and 1/3 of this line is going to be about where the chin should be. So now, knowing this, I'm going to try to capture the directions and the shapes of the face here. I'm taking note of the angle at which the hair is coming down onto the face. Okay, so now coming down here, I can kind of infer that the arm is going to be along the outermost edge of this shape, and down here is roughly where the hand should end. So I'm going to just mark that down right there. So remember this line here that we used to find the chin? Well, we're going to mark that down once again, and then we're going to mark where the elbow is going to end, and then we're going to mark the tip of the finger. So you can see that this is almost broken down into perfect thirds. So taking this line right here and breaking it down into thirds, I think that is where the elbow is actually going to end. So knowing this information, now I can follow this line down and really capture the angle of this arm. So looking over here at where it's going to connect to the shoulder, we can see this big triangular element that is formed between the arm and the face of the character. So if we just try to capture that same triangular shape down to the elbow, we can kind of get an idea that this is where the shoulder is going to be. So finding the shape of this arm, marking that down, finding that elbow. Now we can start to cut away at this big bounding shape and find the shape of the body. Looking at the legs now, you can see that it kind of comes down in a bit of a swoop, and following that, we can add the same shape to our drawing. Now, taking note of how far the crease is from the underside of the arm, looking for those relationships, replicating that in our drawing right there. Remember the distance between the crease and the underside of the arm. So now while doing this, I've realized that the backside of the character might be extending out a little bit too much, and I'm going to just fix that right now. And now, like we said before, where the shirt actually ends is where the shoe is going to start. And the point of the shoe is going to be quite a bit higher than the tip of that finger. So the shoe should end right about there, erasing the guides. Now look at this drawing from a glance. I think it looks somewhat right, but I think this shape here between the leg and the arm versus the shape here between the arm and the head, it looks like my drawing is a little bit off with this because the shoulder is a little bit too low. So I'm going to just liquefy it and fix it real quick before we move on to the detailing stage. Now I'm just going to move this arm in a little bit more too so that it lines up with the arm on the inside. Right, so looking over here, you can see that there is this intersection between the two arms and they kind of touch in that area. Okay, so I think this looks pretty good. Now I feel confident to go on to the detailing stage. Just gonna add on top a new layer, and we can use some curved lines now and some lines that can describe the hair a little bit better. So this process is really simple. You know, once you set down the big shapes, you can kind of just go over it with a little bit more detail, a little bit more refinement, basically just following the lines that you've set down before. It's almost like constructing a building. You know, you've set down the concrete and you're just adding the glass on top. I think I'm gonna move the back in a little bit. So that looks pretty good to me, and you could do the same thing to find the different relationships between the facial elements, but for the sake of time, I'm going to just draw these in from my mind. Add the hairline right there. Okay, just adding in some of the details here, and then we can, moment of truth, flip canvas horizontal. And I think there are some tweaks that I want to make. For example, the back of the head. This is a mistake that I tend to make a lot. You know, I just shift it over a little bit too much, but that looks a lot better to me. So I think this is pretty much good to go. This drawing, you know, turned out pretty good. Again, using the same methods of finding the big shape, detailing, and then refining. Okay, so here's a little bit more complex of a composition. So now the first thing I want to look for is the big shape that is a character. I'm looking for the distance between the top of the frame to the top of her head, and I think the top of her head will start somewhere there. And I'm also looking for the distance between the back of her body and this side of the frame. So I think should be right about there. Finding the shape, finding the direction of the shape. Again, just outlining this big shape here. Finding the shape of the legs. I think that's a pretty good bounding box for the character. The next thing you're going to see is that the window actually leads our eye right into the face along with the bottom here. So we're going to make note of this. So this is an instance where the negative space right here is very important. You want to make sure that you are leaving the same amount of negative space between that window and the back of the character. It's just a really quick and easy way to check the accuracy of your sketch. So now I'm going to look for the secondary shapes within this bounding box. I'm going to come down here. I'm going to draw that vertical line that kind of marks the direction of the tilt of the head, and then I can kind of try to mark the chin down. If you're not sure where to put this chin here, just measure the top of the head and the bottom of the chin and see how much space they take up on the entire scale of the body here. And in this reference photo, they take up almost 1/3, a little bit less than 1/3. So it should be right about there. Knowing where the chin is going to be is going to help us a lot. Now we can add in the shape of the face. Again, following that direction, taking note of the distance between the chin and the shoulder. And now I'm also looking at the fact that the outside of the face kind of lines up with the outside of the shoulder. So drawing a line here, I know the shoulder is going to be around there. It's not going to come forward and it's not going to go back too far. This is really how you gauge the accuracy of what you're drawing and how you know where to put down certain lines. When you see my process videos on Patreon and when you look at the portion where I sketch, all of this process is actually happening in my head. You know, there really shouldn't be a line that you put down that you're just like, oh, I feel like it might be there. You should always reference other things in the composition to confirm the location that you think it's at. All right, so now I'm looking at this big shape right here of the skin on the shoulder. Try to capture that in my drawing too, right there. And then there's a hair that comes down from the head. There's a little bit more hair right there. I think these shapes look quite compelling. When I put this side by side with my reference, I think it looks pretty accurate. So now I'm going to turn down the opacity and I can go on top and add in the details. This is almost like a tracing stage, but I'm just, you know, refining what's already there a little bit. You know, so adding in some of these curved lines, and we can even add in some of the wrinkles on the clothing that we see here. Basically tracing over the big shapes that we've laid down so that, you know, we are drawing on top of a foundation that is very solid. Now this is pretty good. Once again, we're gonna look for the relationships between the eyebrows and the eyes, as well as the vertical spacing between the forehead, the eyebrows, the nose, and the nose to the chin. So these are things that we wanna keep in mind as we observe the measurements and relationships between the different facial components. Now, since I know that the general rule of thumb is that the face is divided into 3/3 from the eyebrows to the bottom of the nose, to the bottom of the chin, I can kind of gauge where things are going to be on the face vertically. Now I'm going to set down the eye line, which is the line between the two eyes, and I'm going to once again divide this into 3 equal thirds and then draw in the eyes. Turning that off, there we go, there's our character, and now we can actually try to flesh out the background a little bit. So looking at this window here, you're gonna see that this line intersects with the hairline on our character. So this point right here on our drawing, we want the window to basically pass through it. So it's gonna be right about there. And then you're gonna also see that this bottom window here kind of intersects with the jawline. So looking for these relationships, right? It's gonna be a little bit down there. Then once we find that, we can see that the handle on the roof kind of lines up with the outside of the character, so we know that it should be right around there. And then just, you know, adding in some of the smaller details on the car door here. And if you're ever not sure where to put certain things, just reference the relationships that you find in the reference photo and make sure that everything lines up with one another. And you can see even right here, the seats and the window, there's this much distance between them. So we want to be able to capture that in our drawing as well. So I think right there, that distance compared to the width of the window, that looks about right. That's where the seat should be starting. Okay, and now we are going to flip the canvas. And I think this looks pretty good. You know, there's not too much else that we could fix here. I think this one is good to go. You know, you could go on top of this and make the line art even more defined, or you could go in with a rendering and turn this into a painting, you know, so this is ready for whatever it is that you're trying to do. Now, moving on to the last piece, I want to use this one to show you guys that this method does not have to only apply to characters and portraits, because you could use this for environments too. So looking at this reference, you know, the first thing that I notice is this big tree and this large shadow shape that kind of frame the composition. So where do we start this tree? Well, it's very simple. Using measurements and relationships, we can see that it takes up about this much of the canvas. So using that same ratio, I think it would start right about there. It doesn't have to be a perfect one-to-one, but you just want to kind of get an idea of where you should be putting certain things. So right there, that would be the tree. And then down here, using that same method, I think that shadow line will start right about there. So now we kind of know where our tree and our shadow is going to be. The next thing I want to look for is our character. How do we find this character? It's actually very simple. Let's look for the bun here. In terms of the vertical spacing of this canvas, we can see that the bun is placed almost exactly on a line that represents 1/3 of the width of the entire canvas. So using that relationship, using that measurement, we can see that the bun of our character should be along this line. Now, how do we find where it should be vertically? We're going to use the exact same method. So if we draw this line across our canvas horizontally, we can see that the chin of our character is almost resting on the perfect halfway point between the top half and the bottom half of this canvas. Okay, so now with this knowledge, we can find that halfway point on our canvas, and this is going to be where our character's chin is going to be, and this is where our character's head is going to be, and here we're going to find that bun. Coming down here, let's look at where our character's feet are going to be placed, and there's about this much space between the bottom of the canvas to the feet of our character, so it should be lined up right there. And once we know this, we can confidently block in the shape of our character, which is this almost diamond kind of shape, very elongated. Okay, and the next thing you're going to notice is there's going to be a bit of a slope between the character and the deer. They're going to form a shape that looks something like that. So now we're going to take that exact same angle and we're going to draw that shape down onto our canvas, and now we know that the deer should be somewhere around there. This is another scenario where the negative space is very important. So looking at the negative space between the deer and our character, you can see that it forms this kind of a shape right here, and we want to capture that exact shape, and we want to be able to capture that shape in our drawing. Okay, so we want to look for that. I think it'll be something along the lines of this, and here we can find the proportions for the deer. Take note of how the bottom of the belly of this deer is below this shadow line. So once again, we're looking for all of these different relationships, right? Sometimes they're completely arbitrary, but you want to use anything that you can to your advantage to be able to spot these things so that your drawing looks 100% correct. So now I'm just going to block in some of these big shapes on our little animal friend here. And the head should be right around there. And at this stage, you know, I feel pretty confident with the shapes that I've laid down. Do not know why I used red, but you know, it's fine. This is not going to be our final sketch. So now I'm going to turn down the opacity and we can start adding in some more details. And this process should be a little bit more fun. At least I think it's a little bit more fun because I don't have to use my brain as much for this process. You know, it's just a whole lot of refining the lines that we see underneath and drawing in some of the small details here. So adding that bun, and then we can add the hand, the shape for the hand, and the bag on the character. So I'm going to turn the original off, and you can see we got this really nice, really pleasant composition here with our character and our little friend. Now, since the background here is very blurred, I'm not going to detail it with my sketch, but if I were to render it, I would add in a whole bunch of colors and then just kind of blur it a little bit. For the sketching phase, I don't think we need to really detail that out. I'm pretty happy with what we've got at the front. So now for the moment of truth, we are going to flip our canvas. And, you know, I see a couple things here and there. So I think I've made the head a little bit too long. And what we could do to fix that is, once again, we're going to go back in and liquefy it a little bit, just to make it look a little bit more proportional. And that is much, much better to me. Okay, so now flipping that around. You know, there's a lot of options that you could do on top of this. You don't have to make your line art look exactly like mine. You could take your line 2.0, your pressure opacity line brush, and you could really flesh out the details in the character. You know, you don't have to make it look as simple as mine. It really just depends on your personal style. You could even add in like simple shading here. Right, so you kind of get what I mean. You know, there's a lot you could do on top of this. Your line art doesn't have to look like my line art, but this is basically the process that I go through, you know, the things that I think about, the things that I pay attention to as I'm trying to sketch a reference photo and turn it into something that is very clear, very readable, and something that I feel confident to go in and render. Honestly, a lot of this stuff doesn't really come out when you're watching a process video because you're just seeing me put down the lines and you don't really understand why I put the lines where I put them and how I know where to put these lines. Well, all of these concepts, you know, the concept of shapes and directions, the concept of relationships and measurements, and the concept of negative space, these concepts are constantly being used in my head as I'm putting down the lines, okay? They're constantly being thought about, and this is something that I always go through as I'm drawing a sketch for one of my paintings. So this is a bit of an inside look into my mindset when it comes to drawing, when it comes to putting down a sketch, and this is why I'm able to really put down a sketch in like 8-9 minutes, because I'm really familiar with these concepts, and you know, I've practiced this over and over again to a point where I almost don't even have to think about it. It's almost just in the back of my head. It's second nature. You know, it just automatically happens in the background. And if you put in enough practice with drawing, you're going to be able to get there too. I'm not some kind of human genius or anything. You know, I just figured out a way for me to make things easier for my brain to understand what I'm looking at. But with that being said though, I hope this video was helpful for you guys. This is just a really useful method and useful mindset to have when you're trying to draw absolutely anything. Okay, so take this with you going forward and try to practice it a little bit in your sketchbook, in your drawing tablet, whatever it is that you've got. You know, try to see how this method works for you. Try to look for all those super obscure relationships in the reference photo and make sure that you're focusing on the big and then working down to the small. But remember guys, everybody draws differently, so this is just my method, my preferred method. I think it should work for most people, but you know, there are some people who just operate a little bit differently, and that's totally fine. And thank you guys once again so much for all your support here on Patreon. It really means a lot to me, and you guys are allowing me to do everything that I do. So thank you so much for that, and I will see you guys on the next tutorial.